This webinar is covering the McCreary report, Beyond the Likes, Social Media Use Among BC Youth. I'm going to do the first half, and Maya Pelled, who works with me at McCreary, is going to do the second half. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that McCreary is privileged to be located on the ancestral traditional and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we're really grateful to be here and don't take our responsibilities on these lands lightly. In terms of what we're going to share today, it's data from the BC Adolescent Health Survey. Most recent survey was in 2023, and that was completed by about 38,500 young people in grades 7 to 12, and it's considered representative of 98% of students in mainstream schools across the province. 59 of the 60 school districts took part. And for this report, we really wanted to dig into the pros and cons of social media use for young people and to look at it specifically by gender. There's been a lot of talk of kind of toxic masculinity among boys and the link to social media. So we really wanted to look for youth of all gender. We're going to share some quotes from young people. Those are in blue. You'll see those come up on the slides, and that was young people who completed the survey. But we've also had reflections on the data from 570 young people across the provinces. The survey is great at telling you why, and young people, or rather isn't great at telling you why, and young people are good at sort of filling in those beats. So we'll share their reflections, and they're also available in a report called The Whole Picture, which is on our website, and we'll give you details of that at the end. So to begin by looking at young people's experiences with social media, so this is young people in that 12 to 19 age group, about 3/4 were on social media on their most recent school day. And for young people of all gender identities, scrolling on social media was the most common activity that they were using their phone for. They were also using it for kind of connecting with family and friends, for gaming, for doing various other things, but most commonly they were using it for social media. And we had 15% who only used their phone for social media that day. And you can see the age breakdown in the graph on the slide there, with older young people more likely to have been on social media that day. So if 3/4 were on social media, that meant that 1/4 were not on that day. Those youth were more likely to report positive well-being if they weren't on social media that day. This included things like being more likely to report good or excellent mental health, to feel good about themselves. Also, they're less likely to experience loneliness. And this was regardless of age or gender identity. And the quote there is from a young person who completed the survey and really sort of speaks to both sides of being on social media. So we've seen sort of the better mental health picture among young people who are not on social media. We really wanted to look at any benefits to being on social media. And the really big benefit that we did find was around social connections. We didn't see a link to more positive mental health or physical health or well-being in those senses, but we did see young people who were on social media the previous day were more likely to have close in-person friends as well as close online friends. And social media might be particularly important for young people who are maybe facing challenges with their in-person relationships, or so, for example, sexual minority young people who are using social media more likely to have friends, including friends they could share their ups and downs with. We didn't tap this through the survey, but young people who reviewed the data also talked about other benefits that they perceived to experience from social media, including things like getting access to information about things like mental health and food and nutrition, as well as providing an outlet for their art, so to share their poetry and their photographs and things like that. We looked at social media use after bedtime. So this is at night after students' parents think that they're asleep. And we know that this is an area that can cause challenges for getting up in the morning. It can be challenging for parents to monitor and stuff. So we really wanted to look at nighttime social media use. And we saw that two-thirds of young people were on social media after the time that they were expected to be asleep. You can see there greater percentage of females, followed by non-binary youth, and then males were the least likely to. And again, we see older youth more likely than younger ones to be on their phone on social media at night. We did definitely see some challenges associated with being on social media at night. These included poorer sleep, poorer self-image and self-esteem, poorer mental health, increased substance use, a link to victimization, and problematic social media use. And I'm going to dig into each one of those now. First one was sleep. And you can see on the chart there, young people of all gender identities who are on social media after their expected bedtime were less likely than their peers who were not on social media to get at least 8 hours sleep the previous night. We also heard from young people who reviewed the data that this was very much their experience. They explained that social media use often delayed them getting to sleep, particularly if they saw unpleasant or disturbing content or had a disturbing interaction, or, with somebody that upset them just before they were supposed to go to sleep. But they also did know, and I think this is key, that social media use at night was often the only time that they got to sort of chill out and relax and be by themselves. So they chose to kind of relax and scroll through social media above getting sleep, even though they know the value of sleep. And they also talked about kind of sleep being interrupted because they didn't want to miss a message or something, so leaving their phone on all night. Recent literature has shown a link between social media use and eating disorders, as well as youth prioritizing spending time on social media over overeating meals. And we found these same associations with missing meals more common among youth who are on social media at night. You can see on the chart there, young people of all gender identities more likely to miss breakfast, lunch, and dinner if they're on social media after expected bedtime. And for example, you can see there females were about half as likely to have eaten breakfast if they'd been on social media at night. Young people who reviewed the data confirmed kind of what we were seeing, that social media use does influence their eating behaviors and beyond just skipping meals. So, for example, they talked about kind of fad diets and viral food challenges and other less eating behaviors, but also kind of using social media to learn about kind of, healthy tips for cooking or, things if maybe their family weren't big cooks or weren't very kind of food literate. We did see young people who are on social media at night were more likely to report low body satisfaction. So they scored a 1 or a 2 as opposed to a 5 out of 5 in terms of how satisfied they were with the body. And we saw this for youth of all genders. So, for example, boys who usually have higher body satisfaction, about a quarter who are on social media at night were reporting low body satisfaction. We're also seeing young people more likely to report an eating disorder if they're on social media at night. Girls are twice as likely, for example, to report an eating disorder. Young people also are less likely to report feeling good about themselves and feeling satisfied with their life when they're on social media. So we were really sort of focused on gender differences and so far not seeing that many differences. We did see real differences in gender in relation to self-harm and suicidality in terms of the link to social media. So female and non-binary youth who use social media after bedtime were more likely to have self-harm, so cut or injured themselves on purpose without the intention of killing themselves, which we didn't see for boys. We did see young people of all gender identities who are on social media at night were more likely to have seriously considered suicide in the past year, but girls were the ones who were more likely to have made a suicide attempt in the past year. Other studies have linked social media and substance use, particularly for girls, and it seems to be linked to influencers advertising alcohol and other products that their young people are then exposed to. And we did see young people who were on social media after bedtime were more likely than other youth to have tried every substance we asked about, alcohol, vaping, cannabis, but as well things like kind of ecstasy and things like that. And we do see if they had tried these, they were also more likely to be using recently and regularly. We did see young people who are on social media at night more likely to be engaged in cyberbullying, both as a victim and a perpetrator. But we see in the spilling over into their offline life as well. So young people who were on social media at night were also more likely to have been bullied in person. So that includes things like social exclusion, teasing, as well as sort of physically attacked, and also more likely to be perpetrating in-person bullying. And we see a link to sexual harassment as well, both physical and verbal. The chart there is showing the example of kind of the increased exposure to cyberbullying for young people who are on social media at night. And the chart looks very similar if we had it for in-person bullying. And then the last one of my slides before I hand over to Maya is we looked at youth who recognised that their social media use had reached a point where they needed help in the past year. And we saw that for youth of all gender identities who were on social media after bedtime, they were more likely to report they needed help for their social media use. So Maya's now going to dig a bit more into that problematic use, including who was at greater risk of experiencing it.
Thanks, Annie. So just under 1 in 5 youth felt or were told that they needed help for their social media use in the past year. Non-binary youth were the most likely to report problematic social media use, as were young people who identified as a sexual minority compared to straight. And as we can see in the graph, youth aged 14 to 16 were the most likely to feel that they had a problem with their social media use. Other studies have found a link between loneliness and problematic social media use. We asked about loneliness for the first time in the 2023 BC AHS, and we also found there was an association. And the more often youth felt lonely, the more likely they were to report needing help for their social media use in the past year. Experiencing challenges in their lives increased young people's likelihood of reporting problematic social media use. So these included things like having experience with government care or an alternative to care, bereavement. So for example, experiencing the death of somebody close to them due to suicide, and poverty and deprivation. For instance, youth who went to bed hungry because there was not enough money for food were more likely to have a problem with their social media use. Youth who reported having a mental health condition were overall around twice as likely as those without such a condition to report having a problem with their social media use. And we can see on the graph, there were similar patterns for males, females, and non-binary youth. And the example on the chart is anxiety, depression, and an eating disorder. So those young people with any of those conditions were more likely to report needing help for their social media use in the past year. Needing help in other areas beyond social media was also associated with problematic social media use. So for example, youth who needed help for their gaming in the past year were around 5 times as likely as youth who did not report problematic gaming to have a problem with their social media use during that same time period. Also, it wasn't just problematic online behaviors that were associated with problematic social media use. As we see in the graph, youth who needed help for their substance use in the past year, so for example, alcohol, vaping, cannabis, and other substances, as Annie mentioned, they were more likely to report needing help for their social media use during that time. Not being able to manage their stress well was also associated with needing help for their social media use. And we saw a similar pattern for youth of all gender identities, with those managing their stress only fairly well or poorly, more likely to report problematic social media use. So despite social connections having been identified as a potential benefit of social media use, youth who had at least one close online friend that they had never met in person were more likely to report having a problem with social media use compared to young people with no such friends. And we see a consistent pattern among youth of all gender identities. There was no clear link between regular sports or dance participation and having a problem with social media use. But we did find that males who exercised at a gym or rec center on at least a weekly basis, they were more likely than males who did so less often to need help for their social media use. Next, we wanted to see if any of the risk factors floated to the top in terms of how strongly they predicted problematic social media use. So we looked at all the factors together, and we did this separately for males, females, and non-binary youth. For youth of all gender identities, needing help for their gaming was the most robust predictor of problematic social media use. And this was followed by using social media after bedtime. And also managing stress only fairly well or poorly had a strong association with problematic social media use. There were also some differences based on young people's gender. So, for example, among non-binary youth, having online friends they had never met in person was among the top factors associated with needing help for their social media use. For females, needing help for their use of alcohol was among the top factors. And for males, exercising at a gym or rec center at least weekly was strongly associated with problematic social media use. So there's something going on there among males when it comes to certain types of activities or exercise and problematic social media use. And this also seems to be connected with what was mentioned earlier about poor body image and eating disorders in relation to social media use, including for males. Next, we looked at the connections, supports, and opportunities in young people's lives that could reduce their likelihood of experiencing problems with their social media use. In terms of friendships, females who had friends to share their ups and downs with were less likely than females without these types of friends to report having a problem with their social media use in the past year. Meanwhile, for males, it seemed to be the number of friends and specifically in-person friends that was important. So those who had 3 or more in-person friends were less likely than males who had fewer in-person friends to report a problem with their social media use. And as we see in the graph, youth of all gender identities who felt they spent the right amount of time with their friends were less likely to report needing help for their social media use than those who felt they spent insufficient time with their friends. We've seen in past studies of a range of topics that positive family relationships is a really strong protective factor. And this was also the case in terms of reducing the risk of problematic social media use. So, for example, youth who felt their family understood them were less likely to have a problem with social media use. And we also found that positive family relationships were protective among youth who are at greater risk of experiencing problems with their social media use. So, for example, among youth who didn't manage their stress well, if they felt they spent enough time with their family, they were less likely to need help for their social media use compared to those who felt they spent insufficient time with their family. Youth who felt their caregivers usually monitored their time online were also less likely to report problematic social media use. And this was also protective among more vulnerable youth. So, for example, among those who often or always felt lonely, if they had caregivers who usually monitored their time online, they were less likely to report problematic social media use than if they had caregivers who never or rarely monitored their time online. Having supportive adults, both inside and outside the family, was protective. So for males and females, those who had an adult either inside or outside their family that they could talk to if they had a serious problem, they were less likely to report problematic social media use compared to males and females who did not have this type of adult support. Also, females who felt that at least one adult in their community outside their school or family really cared about them were less likely to report needing help for their social media use compared to females without this sort of adult. And this was not seen among males and non-binary youth. Positive school experiences is another one of those robust protective factors across studies. And this was also the case for reducing the likelihood of problematic social media use. So, for example, as we see in the graph, connected to school reduced the likelihood that youth would need help for their social media use. Also, males and females who had plans to continue their education after high school were less likely to report needing help for their social media use compared to those who did not expect to graduate from high school. We did not find that taking part in specific activities were protective, like sports involvement, but youth who felt that their activities were meaningful to them were less likely to report problematic social media use. Also, if they enjoyed taking part in physical activities, that helped to reduce their risk of needing help for their social media use. Feeling connected to the community was also important, and the more connected youth felt, the less likely they were to report problematic social media use. And youth who felt that they spent enough time in nature were less likely to have a problem with their social media use compared to those who felt they spent insufficient time in nature. So the youth we spoke with about the BC findings talked a lot about wanting to find a safer way to engage with social media and about wanting to learn digital literacy skills starting in elementary school. They wanted support to understand their motivations for being on social media, as well as support to recognize fake news and AI-generated postings. They wanted to know how to keep themselves and their information safe, and also how to create boundaries and manage online relationships so that they could have healthy relationships online. And they also wanted adults to model healthy interactions with social media. So we talked about connections and opportunities that were found to reduce the risk of youth social media use becoming problematic. There are other recommendations out there, including from the Canadian and American Psychological Associations to support youth in this area. So these include things like ensuring youth receive age-appropriate social media literacy training. This can include supporting them to question the accuracy of what they see on social media, to understand how their content might be stored and shared, and to learn what may and may not be appropriate to post. It's also important to have ongoing conversations with youth about the content that they're engaging with online. Adults should try to minimize young people's exposure to content that includes illegal or unhealthy behavior, so things like self-harm, harm to others, and cyber hate, so like discrimination and prejudice. Youth should be supported to avoid using social media for social comparison, and also supported to understand that others' images and content can be manipulated and enhanced. Adults should help to ensure that youth social media use doesn't interfere with health promoting activities, so things like sleep and physical activity. And they should be aware of youth social media use and signs that their use might be becoming problematic. So things like not being able to put their device away, trying to constantly access social media, not socializing in person, or not doing physical activities because of their social media use. It's also helpful if adults are aware of available resources to support youth who may be struggling with their social media use. So now just to sum things up, the results showed that using social media is a reality for most BC youth, with the majority having used it the previous school day and after their expected bedtime. For youth of all gender identities, social media use was associated with poorer health and well-being. The report highlights potential interpersonal harms associated with social media use, so things like cyberbullying and also in-person bullying, as well as potential benefits relating to social connections. Youth as young as 12 reported problematic social media use, and this suggests that social media literacy education should begin in elementary school and continue through grade 12 as young people's interactions with various social media content and platforms evolve. For youth of all gender identities, the strongest predictors of problematic social media use were needing help for their gaming, poor stress management, and nighttime social media use. There are also gender-specific risk factors like exercising regularly at a gym among males. Supportive connections and relationships at school, in the family, and community were all important protective factors associated with the reduced likelihood of problematic social media use. And taking part in activities that youth found meaningful and enjoyable was also important. And we've heard from youth that they want to learn strategies to manage their social media use. And they've also pointed out that it's not just a youth issue, but an adult issue as well. So the report includes information about a number of resources that can support youth with their social media use. And McCreary's Youth Advisory and Action Council is also in the process of creating resources on this topic, and those will be out soon. So now I'll just hand it back to Annie.
Thanks, Maya, and thank you for listening to this webinar. I hope you found it useful. If you do have questions or comments, Maya's email is the top one and mine is the middle one. And if you would like a copy of the report, our website address is at the bottom there, and the report of the youth's response to the data and their the posters that they create and that Maya mentioned will all be on that website as well. So thank you again for your time.